love and anticipation that surrounded those Easter baskets. In the early years of my childhood, my mom and Baba spent the weeks of Lent in prayer and preparation for the resurrection of Christ. And for me as a small child, a big part of this preparation was getting to help put all of my favorite treats in the basket to be blessed. As I got a little older, being entrusted with the sharp knives to cut the Ukrainian sausages, slices of Easter ham, cheese, and Baba's homemade Easter breads felt like a big girl responsibility. Even when I got gently scolded for how lopsided my bread slices were, I still felt proud that I had helped bring something sacred to the table. I have great admiration for the diligence and intentionality that my parents and maternal grandparents fed into my spirituality as a young child. And yet, almost equal gratitude for the inconsistency of the religious practices of both of my parents. My favorite childhood memories are those of late-night conversations with my dad revolving around paranormal activity and his latest angelic encounters, and my mom and I sitting together at the kitchen table over breakfast or tea and discussing what my dreams of the previous night might have meant. Hardly memories of a strict Orthodox upbringing. And yet, somehow, with all of their eccentricities, both of my parents had, and still have, as far as I can tell, a deeply rooted faith in something. And although I still can't really put a name to what that something might be, so do I. But when I was 4 or 5 years old, that something was a pretty cut and dry image of Jesus sitting in the clouds and waiting for Easter morning to bestow new life to my recently deceased bunny rabbit. True story. And then, in my early teenage years, I hit the inevitable woman power phase of life. Having been very strongly influenced by my mom working on a thesis which revolved around pre-Christian, potentially goddess-worshipping Ukrainian peasants, I took on a pretty unbalanced anti-patriarchy view of the world and spirituality and embraced a partially self-invented form of feminist paganism that was pretty much purely based on the bits and pieces of information my mom shared of her research findings, my own internet research, which, as we know, is always accurate and reliable, and from the rituals and practices which I had observed being made in my favorite spiritual reference book at the time, The Mists of Avalon. In fact, it was during this phase of my journey that my mom introduced me to Westwood. Likely a covert attempt on her part to snap me out of my anti-church mindset, but whatever her intention, even though I initially came kicking and screaming, Westwood and I stuck together from the get-go, and I started hesitantly referring to myself as a Unitarian when I was around 15. I realize that I've digressed considerably from what I set out to share, but it's all connected, I promise. It was around the time that I started coming to Westwood that my mom joined a small Jungian analysis discussion group here in Edmonton. Having just emerged from my resist everything my mother is interested in stage of youth, I very quickly became almost as well versed in Jungian psychology as she was, absorbing everything she told me and borrowing many of the multitudes of books which she began to purchase on the subject to read for my own pleasure. I had always had a strong interest in my dream life and the notion of life being a quest of sorts, and Jung introduced a means of really connecting with my inner world in a very concrete and observable manner. I was hooked. Here now was a way of beginning to connect all the dots in my life that had previously seemed chaotic and random. Here was a way that I could become active in creating my own story and getting to know the many, many characters in my own internal dramas. And here was a way that I could be seeking and growing and knowing all at once. Jung's ideas shifted my perspective radically in my later teenage years. I began to really understand and experience the miraculous phenomenon of synchronicity, like our Rushnek, on an incredibly regular basis, and it led me to some astounding insights about myself and the life that I was living. I began to evaluate people and ideas and myself in a very different light than I had been previously, and perhaps ironically, Young scientific, if a little eccentric, theories brought me closer to a spiritual path and a faith in something bigger than myself in a way that nothing else had, because they, like Unitarianism, begged me to question and question again what I was seeing and experiencing in daily life. And, perhaps most importantly, I began to see that there was potential for meaning and purpose in everything. So, with these new tools of knowledge at my disposal, I began the incredible and daunting task of looking back and, once again, trying to make some sense of it all. Funnily enough, when I started to look back with the intention of making connections started to fall into place. I began to understand that maybe, just maybe, some of the things that I had been perceiving as obviously opposing and unharmonious, completely different ideas may, in fact, have one, okay, maybe even a few things in common with each other. A few years further down the road, I even began to realize that these similarities don't necessarily have to be present for everyone to get along, but that's a different story.